and welcome to Indy Talks, the monthly interview show brought to you by the Hudson Independent, the most trusted news source in the river towns. My guest today is Lee Kennedy. Lee is a retired architect, but he also has a hobby, and I think I could call it even more than a hobby. It borders on a real expertise, or becomes a real expertise, on flags. And Lee is going to talk to us today about a little bit about how he got interested in flags, and in particular the genealogy of the American flag. And we've got a few flags to show you a little later on after we've talked a bit, and so we have some show and tell part of the show. So Lee, welcome to Indy Talks.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, when did all this begin?
With a 14-star flag, and I saw in Pulteney, Vermont, 60 years ago, I think, the 4th of July. Betsy Ross flag with a single star in the middle, and that piqued my interest, and then it became more intense when we moved from the city into to Millbrook, had a flagpole, had some old flags there. By that time I discovered I had four relatives that fought in the Revolution, so I became interested in Revolutionary War flags, and 300 flags later I had a nice collection of flags.
So where did you find 300 flags? Obviously not all in one place.
Oh, absolutely not. I scoured most of the museums in down East Maine, a lot of them around here, and there were people who would call me and contribute one, or contribute a flag. I had a dear friend whose mother had been, who was French, and who was in Paris when the troops freed Paris, and she had made a small British flag, handmade, to welcome the troops there. So that was a special flag.
So as you begin to collect these flags and you start to look at the patterns of them, obviously with the American flag, you can date them by the number of stars that are in there, because each star represents a new state as it came into the Union. But what else about these flags attracted you to it? What else made you want to keep going and digging further into this? You mentioned earlier, you talked a little bit about this genealogy factor. Can you talk about that?
Well, it turns out that the American flag has a history as fathers and grandfathers, just as each of us do, grandmothers as well, and mothers, that goes back to about the 8th century in Scotland. And the Psalter of St. Andrew, the patron saint of Scotland, and also the cross of St. George, adopted by the English in 1245. And there's a transition that occurs, and then when James IV of Scotland becomes James I of the United Kingdom, then there's a blending of the two, and that's where we end up with the British flag. And the British flag then has its children, and one of those is a red ensign. It's a red flag with a British Union. We'll show you one similar to that in a minute. And from that came the American flag, and which we've had 27 official American flags and another 10 unofficial, because in some cases several states were admitted at one time.
When we think, at least when I think of the American flag, I think of the pattern of stars up in the left-hand corner and then red and white stripes down the side. It hasn't always been that way?
It has always been that way. The first flag was prescribed, we celebrate the Flag Day on the 14th of June, 1777, the first Flag Act, and that said that the American flag would have 13 stars, white stars, on a blue canton. The corner in the upper left-hand corner is called a canton. We call it the Union because, as you'll see, the early flags had the Union Jack in the upper left-hand corner. And it also called for 13 stripes, red and white. Now, when Vermont joined, and when Kentucky became a state, the second Flag Act in 1795, they suddenly had 15 stars and 15 stripes. And of course the famous 15-star flag is the one at the Smithsonian, which flew at Fort McHenry during the War of 1812, the one to which Francis Scott Key wrote his poem,
Star Spangled Banner.
Star Spangled Banner. In 1820, I think it is, or 1818, the third Flag Act was enacted, and we ended up with, I think, say 20 stars, and we went back to the 13 stripes. So it stayed at 13 stripes, but each time the state is added, the following July the 4th, that flag becomes official, and the naval flags all ended up in rows. The civilian flags ended up in various patterns. I think it's also important to remember that the flag began as a form of identification. It was transformed after the Civil War, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But it was an insignia that was you had to wear a flag of your own country on the back. That's the blunt end of the boat, the stern. Else you were considered a pirate, and any one of the official countries could seize you. So it was important, and that was the rationale behind the first American official flag. Now we know that I found that about 30 variations of the 13 star flag.
30 variations?
About 30 variations.
People were experimenting with the idea.
Oh, they were experimenting. I think every combination possible with 13 stars, which is sort of a tough number to work with in the first place.
Right. But we're going to get to Betsy Ross towards the end. I want to hold off on that because that's an interesting story unto itself. And maybe we ought to start a walk through some of the flags you brought. But before we start the show and tell, these flags that you brought with you here today are not original flags.
No, they're not.
They are replicas of the
That's
flags.
right.
And tell us a little bit about, first, what happened to the collection of original flags that you had collected.
Well, the original 300 flags, about 200 of them were American flags of one form or another. And when we moved from Millbrook, well, you can imagine with 300 flags, that's a bunch. And I didn't have a place to keep them. And so at that point I decided I wanted to give them to a museum. And it ended up that a museum in my hometown of Oklahoma City wanted them, so they got them. And a lot of those flags, I had a lot of flags, original flags, that went back to about 1840. Flags before that are very difficult to find. They're also very fragile. Cotton didn't come in until I think about the mid-1800s. But those earlier flags were either handmade, wool, or the regimental flags, those worn by the militia, as it says in the Second Amendment, militias.
Yes.
Because that's what the Army was.
Right. Well-armed militias?
The well-armed militias. A lot of those flags were painted silk, and very few of those remain. But it's...
But these flags here are made of nylon?
Most of these flags are now, they can be, the common materials now are cotton, nylon, and two different strings, and also polyester. Now, the early flags were either made, as I said, they're silk or linen early on, and wool. And a lot of that wool came from the UK. And a lot of them just don't survive. So in handling old flags like that, we always treated them with white gloves, literally, just the same way you do with old paper, or any old garments. But the polyester flags are inexpensive. They're suitable for a lot of use. I did find in one of these that it suffered from a little bit of stretch. It kind of, instead of being a rectangle, it became kind of a parallelogram. But a lot of these flags are available. They're easily findable on the internet.
Did you have any of these made for you specifically? Or
None of these, but some of the flags that I had in my original collection, I had some made. And there was a lady who had a flag shop in Poughkeepsie, and she supplied me with a lot of flags, and I commissioned her to do some flags.
And that shop is still there in Poughkeepsie? Do you know?
I don't think it is. I don't think it is.
So we can't tell our viewers where to go to find the flags for themselves?
No, I think I know it's just Reichart Flag Shop is the name.
Reichart Flag
Yeah.
Shop, okay.
So if you find it, let me know.
Okay. Well, let's take a look at some of these things. We'll just hold them up here for viewers, and you can explain what each individual flag is.
Well, now, here is the British Union, the Union flag. It's called the Union Jack because on a British ship, this flies on a flagstaff at the front end, the pointy end of the boat. It's called the bow, and it's called the jack staff. And so this got the name as Union Jack. It's actually the Union flag. And you'll notice there's no red stripe in here for Ireland, because that wasn't added until the early 1800s, until Ireland separated in 1850. But what's interesting about this flag is it's very similar, if not the same, as the flag that was on the West India, East-West India Company boat, the famous Tea Party in 1774. And so I have a feeling that some of the guys that got on the boat and dumped the tea
in the Boston Harbor
may have commandeered this. And this is actually then the flag that George Washington assumed when he assumed command of the colonial army on January the 1st, 1776. And it's interesting because it has the red and white stripes, and that's the beginning of it all.
But what would the British have been flying opposed to this when they went into battle against the Continental Army?
They would have been flying this part with either, the military ships would have been white with a red cross of St. George in it.
Right.
So it's the white flag, red cross of St. George signifying Christ on the cross.
Okay,
Okay?
that's number one.
Because of the need for identification, in 1777, one Essex Hopkins fashioned the first flag act to say 13 stars, white stars on a field of blue, and 13 stripes. And this is the flag, this is a reproduction of the flag. I like to call them commemorative instead of reproductions, but that's just being polite. It has the 13 stars on it.
It occurs to me that, and I'm sure it's occurred to you a long time ago, that putting a pattern together with 13 is not easy.
It isn't
You
easy.
probably have different variations of this on different flags,
Yes, that's the 30 variations.
which we're going to see a little.
We're going to see some more. One of the other things is, hold this for just a moment, just hold that up. You'll see on here the cross of St. George and the Psalter of St. Andrew, which is kind of interesting. But there are a lot of other patterns. This is the one that all of you will recognize as the first American flag, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But here there are 13 stars in a circle. Interestingly, philosophically, you could look at this as a continuous line that represents eternity.
Now, is that the one allegedly made by Betsy Ross?
This is the one allegedly made by Betsy Ross.
Okay.
We do know.
We'll get into what the allegedly part later.
Like, this is one of my favorite ones. It's one of three of the Don't Tread on Me flags. There's the one that a lot of you will know is the yellow one with the coil snake, which was actually commissioned by a Senator Gadsden in South Carolina for the first Commodore of the Navy. And his name escapes me.
But I always associate the snake and the Don't Tread on Me with New Hampshire. Is that right, or but this isn't New Hampshire?
This is not a New Hampshire flag. It's also, there's another one that has red and blue stripes, which also says it has the snake running like this, and it says "Don't tread on me." And what's interesting is that when this flag flies, if there's a nice little breeze, not one that's standing.
You're going to tell me the snake moves.
The snake moves, which is really kind of fun. This is different. This is actually from the battle at Cowpens. Completely different. Red and blue stripes, a white canton, and in this case, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 pointed stars. Cowpens was either there were three battles that are of importance at Cowpens, at Guilford Courthouse, and then finally at Yorktown. Now, this is one of my favorites, and it's one of my. This is the flag that John Paul Jones had on his tanker Ben Franklin suited him up with a sort of a merchant ship, and he went after this super powerful British frigate called Serapis.
State-of-the-art.
State-of-the-art, like one of our missile carriers today, or missile cruisers. And so we know this flag is because this one and the companion boat, the Atlantis, after John Paul Jones managed to capture Serapis and his boat, Bonhomme Richard, sank, he sailed into a little town of Texel, Holland, and the dockmaster, figuring that he had some sort of pirate here, had a watercolor commission of this one and the other flag, and lo and behold, in the early 1900s, the paintings turned up in an art museum in Chicago. So it's one of the few accurately reported. Now this one,
We've got a different.
this is a whole different thing. This has the scissor tail on it, and that's the sign of a military guidon. This would have been carried by the cavalry during the Civil War. Now, I'm more familiar with it having white stars, but the stars could be either white or yellow, representing silver or gold. And those were the noble colors in heraldry. So there's some heraldic background to these flags to boot. So, but the guidon was a flag that would have been carried. Up to that time, the Americans didn't carry flags in battle, in spite of several popular movies to the contrary.
Before we put this down, how many stars?
Oh, I think it's 32. I'd have to stop.
So
Hold
that
on
would
just a
place it
moment.
when?
It's going to place it around 1864.
Right in the middle of the Civil War.
Yeah.
Right.
You may, if you watch the movie Kevin Costner, I think Dances with Wolves.
Oh, Dances, okay.
I think he's seen with a flag like this, and the scissor tail was a typical flag for the
For a
cavalry.
second there, you were going to refer to the movie Glory, which was about the African-American troop from Massachusetts that went into battle in South Carolina, and I just wondered what flag they would have flown.
Probably not any.
No.
I mean, the Americans, I think, up until even the First War, troops got on and they got lines and then they fired at each other.
Right.
But the Americans learned from the Native Americans how to fight sort of guerrilla warfare.
Right.
And
It's called cheating by the British. Yeah, but to carry the flag into battle was one of the most dangerous things you could do, right?
because if the flag was captured, it meant that the general or the king was killed or captured, and the battle was over.
Right. So keep that thing aloft at all cost.
You do, you
Right.
do.
Okay.
And it was also, the flag, you have to remember also, there wasn't any internet or intercoms or walkie-talkies, so the general would always be back, and could be back at a distance of about a mile, because at that distance, that's about as far away as one can be and recognize the color of a uniform, and that would explain why they wore bright blue or bright red uniforms.
Close enough to see the whites of their eyes?
Yes, well, not close enough to see that. A mile's a little far to see
Yeah.
the whites of their eyes, but at least you can see the color of their uniform.
Right, okay. So let's talk a little bit about Betsy Ross. So I learned a lot talking to you about this, so explain to our viewers what you know about Betsy Ross and the work you've done in trying to track down her role in creating the quote-unquote first American flag.
Betsy Ross was born in 1752. She was 20 years younger. Elizabeth Grissom, Betsy Nee would be Betsy Ross. She was 20 years younger than George Washington. She made flags. A lot of women made flags in Philadelphia and in Baltimore.
Who do they make flags for?
Well, they made American flags.
Right, just
They made flags for, there were regimental flags. These were all sewn flags. We have records of the fact that Betsy Ross had bought fabric because the colonial people kept very good detailed records of expenses and that sort of thing. Problem is, we've never been able to document or provide provenance that the meeting that's always described ever happened, or if indeed she really did design the first flag. Now, it turned out that her grandson, almost 100 years later, addressed the Philadelphia Historical Society. And I've read his speech. It's a 30-minute speech of going around and around. But very much to his credit, he searched the Smithsonian, the archives, and could not find any place where there had been identified the maker of the first flag. And so he decided, through some questionable logic, in my view, that because they hadn't been able to find the first flag, that it was within the family tradition from his mother that his grandmother had designed, had made the first American flag. It may very well turn out that she made one of the first American flags, but be that as it may, it's interesting because following the Civil War, in this period from about 1870, and I think probably William Canby, her grandson, who delivered this paper and made the claim, really kind of set the tone for several things to happen between 1870 and 1900. A lot of states were admitted. That became the legend, if you will, of Betsy Ross. There's two famous paintings. One of her sitting there in a room with Ross and Washington and a third gentleman, and she's sewing the stars on the flag. And there's another one where we see three men walking, and they're all kind of battle-worn and tattered. One's carrying a Betsy Ross flag, one's carrying a recorder, I think, or a flute, and one's carrying a snare drum. And all of that combined with the development of the Star Spangled Banner, which was Francis Scott Key's tune, put to an English pub song, of all things, and also the Pledge of Allegiance. And all of this kind of came together as America was coming together as playing a dominant role, beginning to play a dominant role in the world. And so the bottom line to all of this is, it doesn't really matter if Betsy really made the first flag, but the fact that we believe this, and it's become very much a part of
the American narrative.
The American narrative, absolutely, that's worth its weight in gold. So, you know, I will tell you this: the first flag that I bought was a Betsy Ross flag. So there you have it. I don't have any prejudices about this. A bunch of us have been trying to solve this for years, and we've never been able to find any conclusive evidence that she.
Well, your grandson couldn't seem to find it, but
he couldn't seem to find it.
And his logic, as I hear you explain it, is basically, if you can't prove that she didn't make it, therefore it's open that she did make it. And
well, that's kind of, you know, lawyers would have a lot of fun with that logic.
Exactly, yeah. But going back again, this being a piece of the American narrative, or really the whole concept of American exceptionalism, it fits right in there, all along with Pocahontas and all the George Washington and the apple tree, and all of these things are part of the myth. So I get the feeling that this is a sensitive topic, at least among people who pay attention to flags. Is that the case?
Well,
you seem a little reluctant to kind of...
Well, I've been reluctant about this because I wrote a piece once that said that Betsy Ross had not designed the first American flag. And I got a 5-page nasty letter from someone actually in Edmond, Oklahoma, which is just north of Oklahoma City, where I grew up.
Your hometown, right?
Almost from my hometown. So, you know, and everyone gets sensitive about various flags. I will tell you, just parenthetically, I found a beautiful 1 meter by 2 meter, that's a little over 3 feet by 6 feet, Nazi flag, which was 2 layers of silk. It was beautifully made. I hung it in my office one day. I came down the next day and I said, No. So, I mean, and I never flew that flag, obviously. But it's, you know, all this is a part of our history.
Yeah.
And my interest is in the history, and I fly these flags regularly now. I have about...
Yeah, I've noticed in front of your house, you've got a flagpole there, and is there always an American flag up on that pole? Or?
Well, if there's not an American flag on there, I have a Swiss relative, and when she shows up, I put the Swiss flag up, and there'll also be a French flag up on Bastille Day.
Uh-huh.
Okay?
But, so there's an American flag and a French flag or a Swiss flag, so what is the
No,
order?
no, two national flags, never on the same pole.
Never on the same pole.
A point of thank you, leading into something here.
I am. I'm trying to get into the etiquette.
It is considered bad manners to fly a national flag over another national flag unless it's wartime, and that's your enemy.
Right.
But the enemy, if that's your enemy, you always take down the enemy's flag. So I see it every now and then, but I don't do that. So on Columbus Day, you won't see the American and the Italian flag flown. That's one of the things about that. One of the other things I want to say about etiquette is that the canton always goes, this always goes on the upper left.
Right.
Okay? Now, if you're going to fly it vertically, you have to turn the flag over so that this is always in the upper left.
Okay.
Okay?
We have friends who have a place up in Canada on the lake there, and they and a lot of their American friends who have property tend to fly a Canadian flag and an American flag on the same pole. That's a no-no?
That's a no-no.
I'll
There's
tell them.
actually someone in my neighborhood, two right across the street, and both of them were flying American flags with foreign flags underneath. They were small. It's okay, for example, if you fly the American flag, and then you would fly the state flag and the city flag, then you might fly the POW flag.
Mm-hmm.
But it's in order.
Right. We have only a little time left. I'm wondering if you could give viewers some idea of where they can go to learn more about flags, any particular books or websites or things like that where...
All you have to do is look up flags on the web.
Right.
And
It'll take you.
there are a number of websites that you can find some flags on. There are several websites where you can find flags.
Right. And books about flags.
And you can find books about flags.
Have you ever considered writing a book about flags yourself?
No. Although I've collected enough data to create a small booklet.
Right. Okay. Well, Lee Kennedy, thank you very much for coming on the show. I think this has been very informative.
Well, thank you.
And I think you'll probably get some phone calls and letters on this one. Probably from some angry Betsy Ross aficionados.
Well, don't be angry at me about Betsy Ross. I'm just always looking for the truth, and remember that it's an American treasure.
Right. Thanks very much.